The morning Sarah left, she told me the forest had already taken everything she wanted from me. I remember standing on the porch of our cabin, watching her Honda bump down the gravel drive until the trees swallowed it whole, and thinking she was wrong. The forest hadn't taken anything. I'd given it freely, every piece of myself I could spare, and I'd never once regretted the transaction. That was 2 years before the thing at Branson camp. 2 years of solitude that felt more like peace than loneliness. 2 years of walking trails I knew better than the lines on my own palms. I'd been a park ranger in the Hiawatha National Forest for 8 years by then, and I'd reached that point where the job stops being work and starts being something closer to identity. Marcus Windrider, Ranger Station 12, 3 miles past the last paved road and about 1,000,000 miles from anything that mattered in the regular world. My territory covered roughly 40,000 acres of mixed hardwood and boreal forest in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. White pine and sugar maple, black spruce in the lowlands, birch stands that turned the hillsides into gold come October. I knew where the black bears denned each winter, which beaver ponds produced the biggest brookies, where the wolves crossed between their summer and winter ranges. I knew the rhythm of the season so intimately that I could feel November coming in my bones weeks before the first hard frost. November meant hunting season. It meant the forest filling with downstaters in their brand new camo, driving their brand new trucks, setting up in camps their grandfathers had built when the deer were plentiful and the winters meant something. Most of them were decent enough. Family men looking to fill their freezers and reconnect with something primal that suburban life had filed down to a nub. Some were idiots who needed reminding about fire safety and proper game processing. A few every year were genuine problems, but I'd never had a problem I couldn't handle. That's what I told myself anyway, during those quiet years after Sarah left. I'd never met anything in those woods that made me feel like prey. The morning of November 8th started like any other. I woke at 5:30 without an alarm, made coffee in the percolator my father had given me before he died, and stood at the kitchen window watching the darkness thin toward gray. The thermometer on the porch rail read 26 degrees, cold enough to firm up the ground, not cold enough for real snow. Perfect trackin' weather, I remember thinking. The deer would be moving. I ate oatmeal with dried blueberries, checked my gear, and was in the truck by 6:15. The Ford was 12 years old and showing it, rust eating at the wheel wells, heater that took 20 minutes to blow warm. But she started every morning without complaint, and that was all I asked of anything. My route that day took me past 6 registered hunting camps, each one requiring a quick check-in to verify permits and answer questions. Standard November protocol. The camps were scattered across my territory like seeds from a careless hand. Some clustered near the fire roads, others tucked into hollows that required serious 4-wheel drive to reach. Branson Camp was the farthest out. 12 miles from my cabin on roads that barely deserved the name, set in a natural clearing where an old logging operation had been a century before. The camp itself consisted of a main cabin built in the 1950s, 2 smaller bunkhouses, and an outhouse that leaned about 15 degrees off vertical. The Branson family had been running hunters through there for 3 generations, though old Cal Branson had died the previous spring, and his son Mike had taken over the operation. I'd met Mike twice before, once at the permit office in Munising, once at his father's funeral. He seemed competent enough, more interested in the business side than his old man had been, already talking about modernizing the cabins and improving the access road. Cal had been a traditionalist who believed suffering was part of the hunt. Mike wanted Wi-Fi and propane heat. The call came in at 7:40, just as I was finishing my check of the Dawson camp near Spruce Creek. Mike's voice crackled through the radio, that particular mix of annoyance and confusion that usually meant someone had done something stupid. "Station 12, this is Branson Camp, you copy?" I keyed the mic. "Branson, this is 12. Go ahead." "Marcus, we got something weird out here. Bait piles are all scattered, like every single one, but nothing's been eaten. You ever see anything like that?" I hadn't. Bait piles, legal ones anyway, consisting of corn, apples, and sugar beets placed in designated areas, were irresistible to deer. Bears would hit them too, especially late in the season before denning. Even the coyotes would pick through if given the chance. But scattered and uneaten, that suggested something had torn through them deliberately for reasons that had nothing to do with hunger. "I'll swing by," I said. "Give me about 45 minutes. "Copy that. We're all in the main cabin. Dogs won't go out." That gave me pause. The Branson camp kept 2 Walker hounds, seasoned hunting dogs that Mike's father had trained personally. Those animals had tracked wounded deer through swamps and across highways. They didn't scare easy. "Say again about the dogs." "They won't leave the cabin, won't even go near the door, just pressed up against the back wall, shaking. Been like that since before dawn." I felt something then, some quiet alarm bell in the back of my mind. But I told myself it was nothing. Dogs got spooked sometimes. A porcupine encounter maybe, or a close call with a skunk. Animals had bad days like anyone else. The drive to Branson Camp took me deeper into the forest than most of my other stops. The road narrowed until branches scraped both sides of the truck, and I had to stop twice to clear deadfall that had come down in recent winds. November storms in the UP had a way of rearranging the landscape, and the Forest Service budget never quite stretched far enough to keep all the back roads clear. I noticed the silence first. It was maybe a quarter mile from the camp, right about where the road dipped through a cedar swamp before climbing to the clearing. I'd stopped to check the depth of a puddle that had frozen over, not wanting to punch through and bury my axle in the muck beneath. The engine was off, door open, my breath fogging in the cold air. Nothing. No chickadees calling their 2-note songs. No ravens croaking in the distance. No squirrels barking warnings at my intrusion. The forest around me had gone absolutely, completely silent, as if someone had pressed a mute button on the whole world. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, listening hard, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. Wind could account for silence sometimes, pushing the small birds into shelter. So could cold snaps, though this one wasn't cold enough to really bite. But this felt different. This felt like the silence that comes before a thunderstorm, that held breath quality of the world, waiting for something to happen. "Getting jumpy in your old age, Marcus," I muttered to myself. But I got back in the truck and locked the door before driving on, which was something I'd never done in 8 years of working these woods. The camp came into view around the last bend, and immediately I saw what Mike had been talking about. The main bait pile, maybe 100 yards from the cabin, had been completely destroyed. Not eaten, destroyed. Corn scattered in a 20-foot radius, apples smashed and flung, sugar beets torn apart like someone had put them through a wood chipper. The ground around the pile was churned up, frozen mud ripped and gouged in patterns that didn't match any animal behavior I recognized. I parked near the cabin and stepped out. 5 hunters were watching me from the windows. I could see their faces pressed against the glass, expressions that mixed relief and uncertainty in equal measure. Mike Branson came out the front door before I'd taken 3 steps, crossing the yard quickly, like he didn't want to spend any more time outside than absolutely necessary. "Thanks for coming out so quick," he said, and his voice was steady enough, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes kept flicking toward the tree line. "I know it probably seems like nothing, but..." "Let's take a look," I said. We walked to the bait pile together, and I crouched down to examine the damage more closely. The destruction was almost systematic. Every pile, I could count 4 separate bait stations from where I knelt, had been hit the same way. Scattered, not eaten, torn apart with what looked like incredible force. And there were tracks. I saw them in the churned mud at the edge of the scatter pattern, partially frozen now, but still clear enough to read. Canid prints, definitely. Too large for coyote. Too large for the gray wolves I'd been tracking for years. The rear paw measured just over 6 inches from heel to toe, with deep claw impressions that spoke of serious weight behind them. But it was the heel that bothered me most. Elongated, almost curved, like something between a wolf and something else. "What do you make of those?" Mike asked. "I don't know," I admitted, which was not something I said often. "They're too big for anything I've got records on. Could be an unusually large wolf, maybe a crossbreed of some kind." "A crossbreed with what?" I didn't have an answer for that. I took photographs with my phone, measuring the prints against my boot for scale. The largest was nearly twice the size of any wolf track I'd ever seen, and I'd seen plenty. When I stood up, I found myself scanning the tree line automatically, that primitive part of my brain finally waking up and taking notice. "Those your dogs?" I asked, nodding toward the cabin. "Yeah. Bruiser and Hank. Best tracking hounds in the UP, my dad always said. Won't go near the door this morning. Won't eat, won't drink. Just huddle against the back wall and shake. I've never seen them like that, Marcus. Not in 10 years. I looked at the tracks again, at the scattered bait, at the wall of trees that surrounded the clearing on all sides. The silence pressed against my ears like a physical weight. No birds, no squirrels, nothing moving at all except the bare branches in the wind. "Keep everyone inside tonight," I said. "I'll run these photos by the DNR biologist, see what she makes of them." "You think it's dangerous, whatever did this?" I wanted to say no. I wanted to tell him it was probably nothing, some freak occurrence with a perfectly rational explanation. But the words stuck in my throat, stopped by something I couldn't quite name. "Just keep everyone inside," I said again. "I'll come back tomorrow with some answers." I left the Branson camp at noon, driving back down the narrow road through the silent forest. And I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me go. Twice I stopped the truck, convinced I'd seen movement in my peripheral vision, but both times there was nothing there. Just trees. Just shadows. Just my imagination working overtime. That night, I emailed the photos to Dr. Elaine Patterson at the DNR Wildlife Division in Lansing. She was the regional expert on large predators, responsible for tracking the wolf packs that had been recolonizing the UP since the 90s. We'd worked together on 6 studies over the years, And she was one of the few scientists I'd met who actually trusted field observations as much as her computer models. Her response came back the next morning. Interesting shots. Track morphology is unusual. Elongated heel suggests possible injury affecting gait, or maybe a bear with canid-like pad structure. Not unheard of. I wouldn't worry too much. Let me know if you get more evidence. Bear with canid-like pad structure. I read that line 3 times trying to make it fit what I'd seen. Bears didn't scatter bait piles without eating. Bears didn't leave tracks with defined claw impressions like that. And bears, even injured ones, didn't make hunting dogs cower against a wall in primal terror. But Patterson knew what she was talking about. She had to. I was overreacting to some unusual but perfectly natural event. I kept repeating these reassurances during those first few days, building walls of rational explanation around a growing knot of dread in my gut. Day 2 brought nothing new. I visited the camp again, found the bait piles undisturbed, noted that the dogs had finally started eating and seemed slightly less traumatized. The hunters had been out in their blinds since before dawn, and 2 of them had already tagged bucks. Normal behavior, normal season. Whatever had caused the disturbance, it seemed to have moved on. But the silence persisted. No birds, no squirrels. Nothing moving in the forest except the wind in the branches. Coincidence, I reasoned. Maybe a cold snap I hadn't registered properly. Something in the weather patterns that had pushed the wildlife into shelter. The rationalizations came easier each time. Day 3, I set up the trail camera. It was an older model, motion activated, with a good night vision sensor. I positioned it near the main bait pile, angled to catch anything approaching from the most likely direction. Standard procedure for any unusual predator activity, and it made me feel like I was doing something useful, scientific, rational. The hunters had started calling me Jumpy Marcus by then, teasing me about my concern for their safety. They were downstate guys, 5 of them, ranging from their early 30s to late 50s. Good old boys who'd been hunting together for years, comfortable in the woods in the way of people who visit them briefly and then go home to heated houses and paved streets. They didn't know this forest. They didn't know that silence like this meant something. They didn't know that the fear in those hunting dogs' eyes was a warning more reliable than any weather report. I let them laugh. I checked the camera. I drove back to my cabin as the sun went down, and I told myself everything was fine. It wasn't fine. I found out how much it wasn't fine when I checked the camera footage on the morning of day 4. The timestamp showed 3:47 a.m. The motion sensor had triggered, and the image quality was clear enough at first. Night vision rendering the clearing in shades of gray-green, the bait pile visible in the center of frame. Then something moved at the edge of the image. Just a blur, gray-brown and impossibly fast, crossing the frame in less than a second. The next image showed only static, and the next. And every image after that, for the remaining 4 hours of recording time, was nothing but gray snow and electronic noise. I stared at that blur for a long time, zooming in as much as my computer would allow, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The shape was too tall to be a coyote, too broad to be a wolf. It moved on what looked like 4 legs but seemed wrong somehow, the proportions off in ways I couldn't quite articulate, and it had killed my camera. Not physically, the unit was still intact when I retrieved it, but something had happened to the electronics in that instant after the blur passed, something that shouldn't have been possible. A malfunction. That was the rational explanation. Equipment failed all the time, especially the older stuff. The blur was probably a large coyote with mange, moving faster than the sensor could properly capture. I cycled through every reasonable possibility that day, but none of them explained why my hands were shaking when I loaded my .357 and strapped it to my hip for the first time in 4 years. The gun felt heavier than I remembered. The holster was stiff from disuse, the leather cracked and dry. I'd carried it every day during my first year in the forest, back when I was green enough to think I needed protection from the wildlife. I'd stopped carrying it when I realized that the animals out here weren't my enemies. They were my neighbors, my charges, creatures far more afraid of me than I had any right to be of them. But something had changed. Something in those woods had shifted, tilting the scales in a direction I couldn't name. And until I understood what I was dealing with, I wasn't going anywhere unarmed. The Branson hunters stopped laughing at me on day 4. I don't know exactly what did it. Maybe they'd finally felt the silence pressing down on them. Maybe they had noticed how their dogs still refused to venture more than 10 feet from the cabin. Maybe they'd just caught the look in my eyes when I warned them, again, to stay inside after dark. Whatever the reason, they stopped laughing. And that night, when I told them I'd be back at first light to check things out, nobody made a joke about Jumpy Marcus. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept getting up to check the windows, peering out into the darkness of the forest that surrounded my cabin on 3 sides. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light through the bare branches, and more than once I could have sworn I saw something moving out there. Shadows that didn't match the trees, shapes that seemed to drift between the trunks with purpose. But whenever I looked directly, there was nothing. Just darkness. Just my imagination running wild in the small hours of the morning. Just the forest that I'd loved for 8 years, suddenly feeling like a place I didn't know at all. I woke before dawn on day 5 with the taste of copper in my mouth and the echo of something I couldn't quite remember fading from my mind. A dream, maybe, or something worse. Some fragment of sound that had worked its way into my sleeping brain and lodged there like a splinter. I lay in bed for a long moment, listening to the absolute silence outside my cabin, and I knew with a certainty I couldn't explain that something was terribly fundamentally wrong. The coffee tasted like ash that morning. I drank it anyway, standing at the kitchen window as the sky lightened from black to gray to the pale pink of a winter sunrise. No birds greeted the dawn. No squirrels chattered in the oak tree that grew beside my porch. The world outside my window looked the same as it had for 8 years, but it felt different now, charged with some presence I couldn't see but couldn't ignore. I was in my truck by 6, heading back toward Branson camp with my .357 on my hip and a growing knot of dread in my stomach. The radio stayed silent the whole drive, which should have been normal but felt ominous. Usually I'd hear chatter from the other rangers, weather updates, maybe a complaint from one of the camps about water pressure or propane delivery. But that morning, nothing. Just static and silence and the sound of my own breathing. The first thing I did when I reached the camp was check the bait piles. All 4 of them had been scattered again overnight, torn apart with the same methodical violence I'd seen before. But this time there was something new. Long gouges in the frozen mud, claw marks that ran for 3 or 4 feet before disappearing into the underbrush. I crouched down to examine them. measuring with my hand, and felt my stomach drop when I realized the spacing. Whatever had made these marks, it had claws nearly 8 inches apart. No wolf I'd ever seen had a paw that size, no bear either. I photographed everything, forcing myself to be methodical, to approach this like any other wildlife investigation. Evidence first, conclusions later. That was the training, the protocol, the way I'd been taught to handle unusual situations. But my hands were shaking as I worked, and I kept glancing over my shoulder at the tree line, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched. Mike Branson met me at the cabin door, looking like he hadn't slept in days. The other hunters were gathered around the table inside, their faces drawn and pale, their voices barely above whispers. The 2 Walker hounds were pressed into the far corner of the room, and when I stepped inside, they started whimpering. A high, pitiful sound that made the hair on my arms stand up. "They've been like that all night," Mike said. "Wouldn't stop crying. We tried everything, food, water, comfort, you name it. Nothing worked. It's like they're scared of something we can't see." I looked at the dogs, at their rolling eyes and flattened ears, and I thought about what I knew of animal behavior. Dogs could sense things humans couldn't. Earthquakes before they hit. Illness before symptoms appeared. Danger before it became visible. These animals were telling us something, screaming it in the only language they had, and I was finally ready to listen. "Tell me exactly what happened last night," I said, pulling up a chair. "Everything, even if it seems insignificant." The hunters exchanged glances. That uncomfortable look of men who don't want to admit they might have been scared, might have. Finally, the oldest of them, a heavy-set man with a gray beard named Dennis, who ran an auto body shop in Flint, cleared his throat. "About 3 a.m, maybe later, the dogs started going crazy, barking, howling, throwing themselves at the door. We thought maybe a bear was sniffing around, so Tom," he gestured at a younger man with a red beard, "he grabbed his rifle and went to the window to look." "What did you see?" I asked Tom directly. He shook his head slowly, his face troubled. "That's the thing. I didn't see anything, not a damn thing moving out there. But the dogs kept barking, and then they just stopped. All at once, like somebody flipped a switch, and after that, they wouldn't make a sound. Just cowered in the corner, shaking. They've been like that ever since." I thought about the blur on my trail camera, the electronic malfunction that had followed. I thought about the claw marks in the frozen mud, the scattered bait piles, the unnatural silence that had fallen over the forest. And I thought about those tracks, too large, too strange, with that elongated heel that didn't match anything in my experience. "Did any of you hear anything?" I asked, after the dogs stopped barking. Silence. Then Dennis spoke again, his voice lower now, almost reluctant. "I thought I heard something. Couldn't swear to it, but it sounded like footsteps, and heavy ones, moving around the cabin. On 2 legs or 4. He hesitated, and in that hesitation I saw the same confusion I'd been feeling since this whole thing started. I don't know how to answer that. It was wrong. The rhythm was wrong, like something that should be on 4 legs, trying to walk on 2, or the other way around. Does that make sense? It made too much sense. That was the problem. I spent the next 2 hours methodically searching the perimeter of the camp, looking for any evidence that might explain what we were dealing with. I found more tracks, the same oversized canid prints I'd photographed before, but now interspersed with something else. Impressions that looked almost like handprints, 5-fingered and broad, pressed deep into the frozen ground alongside the paw marks, as if whatever had made them had been walking on all fours sometimes and upright at others. The rational part of my mind was working overtime, trying to fit these observations into some framework I could understand. A bear with an unusual gait, a wolf with deformed paws, a feral dog, maybe, grown massive in the wilderness without human contact. Hell, maybe even a hoax, some elaborate prank by kids from town or a viral video setup that had gone too far. But none of those explanations accounted for the way the dogs were acting. None of them explained the silence in the forest, the absence of every small creature that should have been going about its business. And none of them touched the fear that had taken root in my chest, growing stronger with every passing hour. I called Dr. Patterson again, and again she dismissed my concerns. Tracks can be misleading in soft mud, she said, her voice carrying that slightly impatient tone of someone dealing with an overexcited amateur. Size gets distorted, shape gets warped. Without a plaster cast or a clear photograph with proper scale markers, it's impossible to draw conclusions. You're probably looking at an injured wolf that's walking oddly due to pain. Give it another day or two, and I'm sure it'll move on. What about the handprints? I asked, hearing the edge in my own voice. What kind of wolf leaves handprints? A pause on the line. Handprints? Marcus, are you sure you're not, have you been sleeping okay? Stress can do strange things to perception, especially in isolated conditions. I hung up without answering. She thought I was cracking up, going bush crazy from too many years alone in the woods. Maybe she was right. Maybe all of this was in my head. Some elaborate fantasy constructed by a lonely mind seeking excitement in the mundane. But the dogs knew better. The dogs were still shaking. I stayed at the camp until nightfall, helping the hunters reinforce the cabin door and nail boards over the gaps in the old window frames. It felt like a futile gesture. If something could scatter those bait piles with the force I'd seen, a few nails weren't going to stop it. But it gave us something to do, something to focus on, besides the growing darkness and the silence that pressed against the walls. I'm going to drive back to my cabin, I told Mike, as the last light faded from the sky. But I'll have my radio on all night. Anything happens, anything at all, you call me, understand? He nodded, his face pale in the lamplight. You really think something's out there? Something dangerous? I looked at the tree line, at the wall of black that had replaced the forest I knew, and I felt that knot of dread tighten another notch. I don't know what's out there, I said honestly, but until we figure it out, I think we should treat it like a threat. The drive back to my cabin was the longest 12 miles of my life. My headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the darkness, illuminating the frozen road and the skeletal branches that reached toward me from both sides. Every shadow looked wrong. Every flicker of movement at the edge of my vision made my heart race. I kept my .357 on the seat beside me within easy reach, and I drove faster than was safe on that rutted track. I made it home without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, that something was out there in the darkness, watching my cabin from the tree line, waiting for... What? I didn't know. I didn't want to know. I locked every door, checked every window, and settled into the chair by the front door with my pistol in my lap. The clock on the wall read 7:47. It was going to be a long night. The waiting was the worst part. Sitting there in the pool of lamplight, listening to the silence outside, I had nothing to do but think and thinking in situations like this is rarely helpful. The mind fills in gaps with possibilities, each one worse than the last, until you're not dealing with reality anymore. You're dealing with every nightmare you've ever had, made flesh and given teeth. I thought about calling Sarah. The impulse came out of nowhere, sudden and strong, and I had my phone in my hand before I realized what I was doing. What would I even say? Hey, remember how you said the forest took everything from me? Well, now something in the forest is taking everything from everyone, and I'm pretty sure I'm next. She'd think I was drunk or crazy, maybe both. I put the phone down. The clock read 11:23 when I heard the first sound. It wasn't much, just a twig snapping somewhere in the darkness outside my cabin. The kind of small noise that happens 100 times a night in any forest. But I was strung so tight by then that it might as well have been a gunshot. I was on my feet before I knew I was moving, pistol raised, eyes straining to see through the window into the moonlit yard. Nothing moved. The birch trees stood skeletal and pale in the silver light, their branches swaying gently in a breeze I couldn't feel. The Ford sat where I'd left it, frost beginning to form on the windshield. Everything looked exactly as it should, and yet nothing felt right. I lowered the pistol, feeling foolish, and was about to sit back down when I saw it. Eyes. Just eyes. Nothing more. 2 points of amber gold light in the darkness at the tree line, reflecting the glow from my cabin windows. They were maybe 40 yards out, near the big oak that marked the edge of my property, and they were absolutely, terrifyingly still. I've seen a lot of eyeshine in my years as a ranger. Deer eyes glow, green or yellow in flashlight beams. Wolves and coyotes reflect back, silvery white or greenish. Raccoons have that distinctive yellow-green. Bears tend toward reddish. Every animal has its own signature, its own color and intensity, and I'd learned to read them like words on a page. These eyes weren't any color I knew. They were gold, not yellow, not amber, but actual gold, like coins or jewelry, like something precious and ancient and deeply wrong. And they were too high, way too high. Deer eyes hit about 3 feet off the ground. A wolf standing alert might push 4, even a moose. The biggest thing in these woods tops out around 6 feet at the shoulder. These eyes were at least 7 feet up. Maybe more. I stood frozen at the window, unable to move, unable to look away. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat, in my temples, in the hand that gripped my pistol with white-knuckled intensity. Part of my brain was screaming at me to do something. Raise the gun, turn on the floodlights, call for help. But my body refused to respond. I was caught in that ancient paralysis that prey animals experience when the predator's gaze finds them. The stillness that comes from knowing any movement might be your last. The eyes didn't blink. They didn't waver. They just watched, fixed on my window, on me, with an intensity that made me feel like I was being measured, evaluated, judged. There was intelligence in those eyes. Not animal intelligence, the calculating assessment of a predator sizing up prey, but something else. Something that felt almost like recognition. Then they were gone. Not turned away, not lowered as the creature moved off. Just gone there 1 second and not there the next, as if whatever owned them had simply closed its eyes, or moved so fast I couldn't track it, or had never been there at all. I stood at that window for a long time, waiting for the eyes to reappear, waiting for something to happen. But the night stayed silent. The forest stayed still, and eventually my racing heart slowed to something approaching normal. I didn't sit back down. I didn't take my hand off my gun. But gradually the paralysis eased, and I was able to think again. 7 feet. Whatever I'd seen had eyes 7 feet off the ground. Bears could stand on their hind legs, could rear up to heights of 8 feet or more. But bears didn't stand that still. Bears swayed and moved and made noise. And bear eyes didn't glow gold in the dark. Nothing's eyes glowed gold in the dark. I tried to convince myself I'd imagined it. The stress, the sleepless nights, the constant tension, they were playing tricks on my mind, making me see things that weren't there. Those eyes could have been anything. Branches catching the light from my cabin. Fireflies, out late in the season. Some reflection from my own window thrown back at me from a pool of ice in the yard. But I didn't believe any of those explanations. And deep in my gut, in that primitive place where instinct lives, I knew I'd seen exactly what I thought I'd seen. Something was out there. Something that had been watching the camp for days. Something that had scattered the bait piles and terrified the dogs and killed my trail camera with its presence alone. And now it knew where I lived. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my chair by the door, pistol in my lap, watching the window until the first gray light of dawn crept over the horizon. The eyes didn't come back, but I couldn't shake the certainty that they were still out there somewhere, watching and waiting for something I didn't understand. Dawn came slowly, the way it always does in November. A gradual lightening of the sky from black to gray to a pale, watery blue that never quite managed to feel like real daylight. I waited until the sun had fully cleared the horizon before I ventured outside, and even then I did it with my pistol drawn and my back to the cabin wall. The yard was empty. The forest was silent. Everything looked exactly as it had the night before, with no sign that anything had passed through. But when I checked the tree line, I found what I'd been dreading. Tracks. They started at the big oak where I'd seen the eyes. Deep impressions in the frozen mud that continued for maybe 30 feet before veering off into the underbrush. The same oversized canid prints I'd seen at Branson camp. The same strange, elongated heels. But now, interspersed with the paw marks, there were those other impressions again. The handprints, 5-fingered and broad, pressed into the ground with tremendous force. And the stride length was wrong. Way wrong. I've tracked wolves for years. I know their gait patterns, their comfortable stride when walking versus trotting versus running. A walking wolf takes steps of about 20 inches. A trotting wolf might stretch that to 30. A running wolf, covering ground in earnest, can manage 5 or 6 feet between impressions. These prints were 8 feet apart. Whatever had made them had been walking. The depth and angle of the impressions made that clear. But walking with a stride no natural wolf could match, unless it wasn't walking on 4 legs, unless it was walking on 2. I photographed everything, my hands steadier now than they'd been at the camp. The fear was still there, curled in my chest like a cold stone, but it had been joined by something else, a kind of grim determination, the stubborn refusal to be terrorized by something I couldn't see or understand. If this thing wanted to scare me, fine. It was doing a damn good job. But I wasn't going to run, not yet. Not until I knew what I was running from. I followed the tracks into the underbrush, moving slowly, pistol raised. The forest pressed close around me, branches reaching like grasping fingers, dead leaves crackling under my boots, despite my efforts at stealth. The tracks continued for maybe 50 yards, then simply stopped. No sign of the creature veering off. No indication it had climbed a tree or jumped a stream. The impressions just ended as if whatever had made them had simply vanished into thin air. That was when I heard the sound. A low, rumbling vocalization. Somewhere between a growl and something that might have been a word. It came from my left, from deeper in the forest, and it seemed to vibrate through my chest rather than enter through my ears. I spun toward it, pistol up, finger on the trigger. Nothing, just trees, just shadows, just the silence pressing down on me like a physical weight. But for a moment, just before the sound faded, I could have sworn I heard laughter, something that was almost laughter anyway. A huffing, breathy sound that carried no joy, but held a terrible knowing intelligence. I didn't run. I wanted to. God knows I wanted to. But something kept my feet planted and my gun raised. Running felt like the wrong choice. The prey choice. The choice that would mark me as something to be chased. Instead, I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the trees, watching for any sign of movement. I made it back to my cabin without seeing anything else. But the feeling of being watched never left. And when I finally got inside and locked the door behind me, I stood with my back pressed against the wood for a long time, listening to my own ragged breathing and trying to convince myself that what I'd heard hadn't been what I thought it was. It couldn't have been laughter. Animals didn't laugh, and even if some did, in their own way, they certainly didn't laugh like that. With awareness, with purpose, with something that felt horribly like anticipation. The radio crackled to life, startling me so badly I nearly dropped my pistol. Mike's voice strained and thin. "Station 12, this is Branson Camp. You copy, Marcus? We need you out here, now." I was moving before he finished speaking, grabbing my keys, heading for the door. "Branson, I copy. What's happening?" "Just get out here," he said, and I could hear something in his voice that I'd never heard before. Not fear exactly, but something worse. Something like awe. "You need to see this for yourself." The drive to Branson Camp felt longer than it ever had, even though I was pushing the Ford faster than the frozen roads safely allowed. My mind kept returning to those eyes in the darkness, to the tracks that ended in nothing, to the sound that might have been laughter. Whatever was happening at the camp, I had a sick certainty it was connected to all of it. I arrived to find the hunters clustered outside the cabin, staring at the tree line with expressions that ranged from shock to disbelief. Even the dogs had been brought outside, and they were cowering at their master's feet, too frightened even to whimper. Mike saw me coming and gestured frantically toward the ridge that overlooked the camp, the high ground where the old logging road switchbacked up to the fire tower. "Look," he said, pointing. "Just look." I looked. It was standing on the ridge, silhouetted against the gray morning sky. A shape that could have been a man if men were 8 feet tall and built like something designed to tear and rend. A shape that could have been a wolf if wolves stood on their hind legs and had shoulders as broad as a door frame. It wasn't moving, wasn't making any sound that I could hear. Just standing there, outlined against the clouds, watching us. The head was wrong. That was the first thing my brain managed to process through the shock of what I was seeing. It was too long, too narrow, with a pronounced snout that jutted forward like a muzzle. The ears were pointed, pricked forward, too large for the massive skull. And even from this distance, maybe 200 yards, I could see the way the body was shaped wrong for any animal I knew. The arms were too long, ending in hands rather than paws. The legs bent wrong, hinging backward at the knee like a dog's, but somehow supporting that massive upright frame. None of us spoke. None of us moved. We stood there in the frozen morning air, staring up at that impossible silhouette, and I could feel the certainty of what I was seeing settling into my bones like cold water. This wasn't a bear, it wasn't a wolf, or a feral dog, or any kind of animal that had a name in the books I'd studied. It was something else, something that shouldn't exist, something that defied everything I thought I knew about the natural world. As if it knew we were looking, as if it had been waiting for exactly this moment. The creature moved. Not away, not toward us, but down, dropping from its upright stance onto all fours with a fluid grace that made my stomach lurch. On four legs, it was still massive, still wrong, but somehow less jarring than its bipedal form. It moved along the ridge for maybe 50 yards, its gait smooth and predatory, and then, just like the eyes the night before, it simply vanished. One moment it was there, outlined against the sky. The next, it was gone, swallowed by the trees without a sound. The hunters started talking all at once, their voices high and frightened, asking questions I couldn't answer. What was that? Did you see that? Was it some kind of gorilla, some escaped zoo animal? What the hell was that thing? I didn't answer them. I couldn't. Because standing there in that frozen clearing, with the wind cutting through my jacket and the silence of the forest pressing down on me like a judgment, I was finally facing the truth I'd been avoiding for days. I didn't know what that thing was, but I knew, with a certainty that went deeper than thought, that it wasn't any kind of animal. Not in the way I understood the word, and I knew something else too. Something that made my blood run cold even as the hunter's questions washed over me unheard. It had wanted us to see it. That wasn't the behavior of a predator stalking prey. That was a demonstration, a message. Look what I am, it seemed to say. Look what you're dealing with. See me, understand me, know that you can't hide, can't run, can't pretend I'm not here. It was playing with us. And whatever game it was playing, I was terrified to find out the rules. The rest of that day passed in a blur of frantic activity. I called the sheriff's office, speaking to a dispatcher who clearly thought I was drunk or delusional. I called Dr. Patterson again, describing what I'd seen in terms that made her go very quiet and then very carefully suggest that perhaps I should take some time off. I tried to convince the hunters to pack up and leave, to get the hell out of these woods while they still could. But they'd come for deer season, they'd paid their fees, they'd made their plans, and they weren't about to let some weird thing in the trees run them off. "We've got guns," Dennis said, gesturing at the rifle rack in the main cabin. "Whatever that thing was, a bullet will bring it down. Everything bleeds, everything dies." I wanted to argue, wanted to tell him he was wrong, wanted to describe the way that thing had looked at us, the intelligence in its posture, the deliberation in its movements. But I didn't have the words, and I could see in their faces that they wouldn't believe me even if I did. I stayed at the camp until nightfall, helping them add more boards to the windows and set up watch rotations, helping them feel like they were doing something useful. But the whole time I worked, I couldn't stop thinking about that silhouette on the ridge, about the way it had dropped to all fours with such fluid ease, as if walking upright was just one option among many, about the way it had vanished without a trace, there one moment and gone the next. What kind of creature could do that? What kind of animal was intelligent enough to put itself on display, to choose the moment of revelation, to wait until we were all watching before it made its move? No animal I knew. No animal that existed in the natural world. As I drove back toward my cabin that evening, the sun setting in a blaze of orange and red behind the western trees, I found myself thinking about stories I'd heard over the years, tales from the local Anishinaabe communities, passed down through generations, about creatures that walked between the human world and something else, beings that wore the shapes of animals but weren't animals, that hunted not just for food but for something darker, something older. I'd always dismissed those stories as folklore, the kind of thing cultures create to explain the unexplainable. But now, with the image of that silhouette burned into my memory, I wasn't so sure. Maybe those stories weren't explanations at all. Maybe they were warnings. I was still turning this over in my mind when I crested the final hill, and my cabin came into view. The truck's headlights swept across the clearing, illuminating the familiar shape of the porch, the woodpile by the side wall, the dark mass of the forest beyond. And there, at the tree line, just at the edge of the light, 2 points of golden amber looking back at me. The eyes blinked once, slowly, deliberately, a gesture that felt less like an animal's reflex and more like a message. I see you. I know where you live. I know you're watching me watch you. Then they were gone. I sat in the truck for a long time, engine running, hands gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles ached. The rational part of my brain was still trying to explain things away, still constructing frameworks of logic and natural history that might contain what I was seeing. But that part was getting quieter now, drowned out by the primitive voice in my head that spoke in nothing but fear. When I finally went inside, I didn't just lock the doors. I pushed the heavy wooden table against the front entrance, stacked chairs against the back door, closed the shutters on every window, and latched them from within. I loaded my shotgun as well as my pistol, placed both within arm's reach, and settled into my chair to wait for dawn. Outside, the forest was silent. But I knew, with a certainty that went beyond evidence or reason, that the silence was not emptiness. Something was out there, patient and watchful, circling my cabin in the darkness like a shark circling a boat. Something that had revealed itself to us deliberately, that had shown us exactly enough to inspire terror without giving us any hope of understanding. And as the long hours of the night crept by, I found myself wondering not what it was. That question seemed less and less important with each passing hour, but what it wanted. Why show itself now, after days of lurking at the edges? Why terrorize the hunter's dogs, scatter the bait piles, destroy my camera? Why stand on that ridge in plain view, letting us see its impossible shape before vanishing back into the trees? I didn't have an answer. But as I sat there in the darkness, clutching my weapons and listening to the silence, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to find out. The night stretched on, endless and black, and somewhere out there in the frozen forest, something that should not exist was waiting for its moment to strike. I didn't sleep that night. Not a single moment of unconsciousness, not even the half-drowsy state that sometimes passes for rest when your mind won't quiet down. I sat in my chair with my weapons beside me, listening to the silence press against the walls of my cabin like something physical, something with weight and intention. Every creak of the settling wood made me flinch. Every gust of wind against the shutters sent my hand reaching for the shotgun. And underneath it all, that terrible certainty that I was being watched, that something out there in the darkness knew exactly where I was and was simply choosing not to act. Yet, day 6. Dawn came slowly, gray light seeping through the cracks in the shutters like water finding its level. I watched the darkness retreat from my cabin with something that might have been relief in another man, but in me felt more like a temporary reprieve, a stay of execution rather than a pardon. The night was over, but I knew with absolute certainty that it would come again, and that whatever had been circling my cabin in those black hours would be waiting. I made coffee with hands that trembled slightly, not from caffeine withdrawal, but from 12 hours of sustained adrenaline. My body felt wrung out, every muscle aching from tension I hadn't even been aware of holding. The simple act of boiling water and measuring grounds felt absurdly domestic, almost laughable against the backdrop of what I'd experienced. But I clung to the routine anyway because routine was something I could control, something that made sense in a world that had stopped making sense 3 days ago. The radio crackled to life around 7. Dispatch running through the morning check-ins with the various stations throughout the Hiawatha. I listened to voices I knew, rangers I'd worked with for years, reporting nothing unusual from their sectors. Clear skies, cold temperatures, normal activity. I almost laughed at that last part. Normal. The word felt like a foreign language now, something I'd once spoken fluently, but had forgotten entirely. When dispatch called for Sector 7, I picked up the handset and reported all clear. The lie tasted like ash in my mouth, but what else could I say? I spotted something on the ridge yesterday, something that looked like an 8-foot-tall wolf walking upright, and I think it's been stalking the hunting camp, and now it knows where I live. They'd pull me off patrol for a psych evaluation before I finished the sentence. They'd probably be right to do it. I told myself I'd drive out to Branson camp that morning, check on the hunters, see if they'd had any more disturbances during the night. But an hour passed, then 2, and I found myself still sitting at my table, staring at the door I'd barricaded the night before. The thought of going outside, of leaving the relative safety of these walls, made my stomach clench with fear I couldn't quite rationalize. It was daylight. Whatever that thing was, it seemed to prefer darkness. I'd be fine. I didn't believe a word of it. Eventually, around mid-morning, my sense of duty overcame my fear. The hunters were my responsibility, at least while they were in my sector. I couldn't hide in my cabin forever. Couldn't let whatever this was reduce me to a cowering wreck. I'd served 8 years in these woods, faced down black bears and injured elk, and more than one belligerent drunk with a rifle. I wasn't going to let shadows and silhouettes unmake me. I moved the furniture away from the doors with deliberate care, checking through each window before I stepped outside. The clearing around my cabin looked normal, undisturbed. The thin layer of frost on the grass already beginning to melt under the pale November sun. The tree line stood silent and still. No movement except for a distant hawk circling high overhead. I stood on my porch for a long moment, scanning the forest edge, looking for any sign of watching eyes or hunched shapes. Nothing. Just trees and sky and the cold bite of morning air. The drive to Branson camp took 15 minutes, though it felt longer. Every shadow under every tree seemed to pulse with potential threat. Every dark hollow between the pines, a hiding place for something monstrous. I kept my windows up and my doors locked, checking my mirrors compulsively, half expecting to see something loping along behind my truck on legs that shouldn't exist. But the road stayed empty, and when I pulled into the camp's gravel clearing, I found the hunters already up and moving. Mike was the first to spot me, raising a hand in greeting as I climbed out of the truck. He looked tired, dark circles under his eyes, but his expression was closer to irritation than fear, the kind of look a man gets when he's been kept awake by things he doesn't understand and has decided to be angry about it rather than scared. "Rough night?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Those goddamn dogs wouldn't shut up," he said, jerking a thumb toward the cabin where I could see the other hunters gathered around the camp stove, whining and scratching at the walls all night. Had to put them in the storage shed just to get any peace. "They whine all night?" Mike nodded, then hesitated, something flickering across his face before he shook his head. "It was weird, though. Real quiet out here. Not a sound from the woods, not even wind. But those dogs were going crazy, like something was right outside the walls." "Did you see anything?" Another hesitation, longer this time. Mike was a practical man, a contractor from downstate who spent 50 weeks a year dealing in concrete realities. Materials costs, building codes, client expectations. He wasn't the type to admit to seeing things that couldn't be explained. But I saw the way his eyes cut toward the tree line, the slight tightening of his jaw. "Thought I saw something moving out there around 3 a.m, he said finally, his voice lower. "Went to the window to check, but it was too dark to make out details, just shapes, movement. Probably just deer or something." "Probably," I agreed, though we both knew I didn't mean it. The other hunters were in various states of exhaustion and irritation when I stepped into the cabin. Mike was making breakfast, the smell of bacon and eggs filling the small space with something almost normal. The others were hunched over coffee cups, speaking in low voices about the night's disturbances. I caught fragments of conversation, strange sounds, shadows outside the windows, the dog's constant whimpering. But no one seemed willing to discuss it directly, as if speaking the words aloud might make them real. "Any more tracks?" I asked Mike, accepting the coffee he offered. "Checked this morning. Nothing new around the cabin." He paused, spatula hovering over the pan. "But there's something you should see. Out by the hunter's blind on the east side." My stomach clenched. "What kind of something?" "Don't rightly know. That's why I think you should take a look." We left the others to their breakfast and walked together toward the eastern edge of the camp, following the narrow trail that led to one of the elevated hunting blinds. The forest was quiet around us, that same unnatural silence I'd noticed before, the absence of bird song and small animal sounds that should have filled the morning air. Our footsteps crunched on the frozen leaves, impossibly loud in the stillness. The blind was a simple structure, just a wooden platform 10 feet up in a sturdy oak, with canvas walls and a narrow slot for observation. It had been here for years, used by generations of hunters who came to Branson's camp each November. I'd inspected it myself at the start of the season, made sure the ladder was secure and the platform was sound. Now, standing at the base of the tree, I could see that something had changed. The canvas on the far side of the blind had been torn, 3 long rents running parallel across the fabric. Not cut, torn, the edges ragged and frayed in a way that spoke of tremendous force. I climbed the ladder slowly, my heart pounding harder with each rung, and pulled myself up onto the platform. The blind was small, maybe 8 feet square, with a simple bench seat and a small shelf for supplies. Everything looked normal at first glance. The old coffee thermos still sitting on the shelf, the worn blanket folded in the corner, the hunting magazine stacked beside the seat. But then I saw the marks on the wooden railing. Gouges. Deep ones, carved into the treated lumber with something sharper than any knife. They ran in groups of 4, spaced like fingers. But the distance between them was wrong, too wide for any human hand. I placed my own palm against the marks, spreading my fingers as far as they would go. The gouges extended at least 2 inches beyond my reach on either side. Saw those when I came to check on the blind this morning, Mike said from below. Thought maybe a bear, but bears don't climb hunting blinds, I finished for him. My voice sounded strange in my own ears, flat and distant. And those marks aren't from claws. The angle's wrong. I was right, and I knew it even as the words left my mouth. Bear claws would have left curved gouges, the natural arc of a swipe. These marks were straight, deliberate, as if something had gripped the railing and dragged its fingers, its talons, its claws, whatever they were, across the wood with conscious purpose. A message maybe, or a warning. But it was what I found behind the torn canvas that made my blood turn to ice. I pushed through the rent in the fabric, expecting to find nothing but the empty air beyond the blind's edge. Instead, I found myself staring at a narrow gap between the canvas and the wooden frame, a space maybe 6 inches wide, hidden from view unless you were looking for it. And wedged into that gap, pressed against the rough bark of the oak tree, was something that shouldn't have been there. It was watching me. That was my first thought, irrational and immediate. It's watching me through a gap in the canvas. And it's been here the whole time. And now I'm going to die. But it wasn't watching me. It wasn't anything alive at all. I reached into the gap with trembling fingers and pulled out what I found there. A strip of fabric, maybe 3 feet long, gray-brown and coarse to the touch. For a moment, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Then the smell hit me, a thick, musky stench that made my stomach lurch. And I realized I was holding a piece of fur. Not fabric. Fur. Animal fur or something like it, pulled from whatever creature had left those gouges on the railing. It was caught on a splinter of wood, torn loose as the thing had moved around the blind. And as I held it up to the pale morning light, I saw something else that made my breath catch in my throat. There was blood on the fur. Not much, just a few drops dried brown against the gray, but enough to tell me something important. The thing that had left this behind, the thing that had been here, in this blind, close enough to leave pieces of itself on the wood, wasn't invincible. It could bleed, it could be hurt. The thought should have been comforting. Instead, it filled me with a new and different kind of fear. Because if this thing could bleed, that meant it was physical, real, not a ghost or a spirit or a figment of mass hysteria, but a creature of flesh and blood and bone, something that could be killed, but also something that could kill. I stuffed the fur into my jacket pocket and climbed down from the blind on legs that felt like rubber. Mike was waiting at the bottom, his face creased with concern. "Well, what'd you find?" "Nothing," I heard myself say, "just animal damage." "Probably a bear, like you said." The lie was easier this time, smoother. I was getting better at this. at pretending that everything was normal when nothing was normal at all. Mike didn't look convinced, but he didn't push it either. Maybe he didn't want to know the truth any more than I wanted to tell it. We walked back to the cabin in silence, the forest pressing in around us like a held breath. I could feel the weight of the fur in my pocket, that coarse gray-brown evidence of something impossible. And underneath my growing fear, I felt something else, a kind of grim determination that surprised me. This thing, whatever it was, had been playing games with us for days, stalking us, toying with us, revealing itself in glimpses and silhouettes that seemed designed to maximize our terror. But now I had proof, physical, tangible proof that it existed. The question was what I was going to do with it. I left the hunting camp around noon, promising to check back before dark. The hunters were planning to stay in that night, none of them particularly eager to sit in blinds or tree stands after what they'd seen and heard. I couldn't blame them. If I'd been a civilian, if I hadn't had 8 years of ranger training telling me that running from a threat only made it worse, I would have been on the road back to the lower peninsula before the sun went down. Instead, I drove to my cabin with the fur burning a hole in my pocket, and in my mind churning through options that all seemed inadequate. I could call the DNR again, try to explain what I'd found, but Patterson had already dismissed the tracks as bear sign. A piece of fur wouldn't change her mind. It would just confirm her suspicion that I was losing my grip on reality. I could contact the local sheriff's office, report an unknown animal threatening the camp, but they'd send a deputy with a rifle who'd never seen anything like this, and who'd probably end up dead or traumatized for his trouble. Or I could handle it myself. The thought came unbidden, dangerous, and seductive. I knew this forest better than anyone. I had weapons, supplies, years of experience tracking and observing wildlife. If anyone had a chance of figuring out what this thing was and how to stop it, it was me. But even as the thought formed, I knew it was foolish. Whatever I'd seen on that ridge wasn't wildlife. It wasn't something you tracked and studied and managed according to DNR protocols. It was something else entirely, something that had been watching us with intelligence and purpose, something that seemed to know exactly how to inspire maximum terror without ever crossing the line into open attack. And that was what bothered me most, I realized, as I pulled into my clearing and sat staring at the familiar shape of my cabin. The thing wasn't just hunting us, it was playing with us, testing us, pushing us toward a breaking point that only it could see. The question was why, and what happened when we finally broke. I stepped out of my truck and immediately knew something was wrong. The cabin looked the same as always, weathered wood and pitched roof, the wood pile stacked neatly against the side wall. But the feeling had changed. That sense of safety, of home, that I'd always felt when I returned to this place, it was gone, replaced by something cold and watchful that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I drew my pistol before I even reached the porch, moving slowly, scanning the tree line with each step. Nothing moved. The forest was silent, that same terrible stillness that had become the new normal over the past days. But the silence felt different now, heavier, more personal, like something was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do. The front door was closed, exactly as I'd left it. The barricade I'd built the night before was still in place, the furniture visible through the small window undisturbed. I circled the cabin slowly, checking each wall, each window, looking for any sign of intrusion. Nothing. Everything looked exactly as it should. But when I reached the back of the cabin, I stopped cold. There were tracks in the soft earth beneath my bedroom window. Not the massive canid prints I'd found at the hunting camp. These were different, more disturbing in their implications. They were almost human in shape, with a defined heel and the impression of toes, but stretched and elongated in ways that made my stomach turn. The spacing between them suggested a stride of at least 5 feet, far longer than any person could manage. And they didn't just pass by the window. They stopped there, turned, faced the cabin. Something had stood here, looking in at my bedroom window while I sat in my chair on the other side of the cabin, clutching my weapons and staring at the front door. It had been here, maybe just a few feet away from where I slept, watching through the glass. And I hadn't known. I thought about the silence last night, the feeling of being watched that had kept me awake until dawn. I'd assumed the thing was circling the cabin, testing the perimeter, looking for weakness. But it hadn't been circling. It had been standing right here, patient and still, watching me through the bedroom window with those golden amber eyes, waiting for me to fall asleep. The thought sent a shudder through me so violent that I nearly dropped my pistol. I backed away from the tracks, my eyes locked on the tree line, half expecting to see a shape emerge from the shadows even in broad daylight. But there was nothing, just the silent forest, watching and waiting as it had been for days. I went inside and locked the door behind me, but the locks felt meaningless now. Whatever this thing was, it had been inches away from me last night. Only the cabin walls had separated us, and those walls suddenly seemed very thin indeed. I sat down at my table and pulled the strip of fur from my pocket, turning it over in my hands, studying the coarse gray-brown fibers, the faint rust-brown stain of dried blood. This was real. This was physical evidence of something that science said shouldn't exist. I could send it to a lab, have them analyze the DNA, see what they could tell me about the creature that had left it behind. But even as I considered the option, I knew what would happen. The lab would test the sample and find no match in their databases, or they'd dismiss it as contaminated, degraded, too compromised for accurate analysis. Or the results would come back marked unknown canid and file away in some drawer, never to be examined again, because the world didn't have room for things like this. The world was organized around rational explanations, around species and categories and the orderly progression of evolution. There was no space in that worldview for an 8-foot-tall wolf that walked upright and watched you through your bedroom window at night. I was still turning these thoughts over in my mind when I heard the sound. It was distant at first, so faint that I thought I might have imagined it. A kind of yipping howl, high-pitched and wavering, echoing through the trees from somewhere to the east. I froze, every muscle in my body going rigid, my hand reaching for the pistol I'd set on the table. The sound came again, closer this time, and now I could hear the complexity in it, the way it rose and fell in patterns that seemed almost like speech, like some terrible language I couldn't quite understand. It wasn't a wolf howl, not really. Wolves sang to each other in long, sustained notes, beautiful in their way, a sound I'd heard 100 times in these woods. This was different, broken, wrong, like something that had learned to howl by listening to wolves but had never quite gotten it right. And then, cutting through the alien howling, I heard something that made my blood freeze in my veins. My name? Not spoken, not exactly. More like the sound of my name being dragged through a throat that wasn't designed for human speech, stretched and distorted until it was barely recognizable, but recognizable nonetheless. Marcus, Marcus, Marcus. I was on my feet before I knew I was moving, backing away from the windows, my pistol raised and ready. The howling continued outside, getting closer, circling the cabin in a widening spiral that seemed designed to confuse my sense of direction. I couldn't tell if it was one creature or many, couldn't tell if it was coming from the east or the west or directly above. All I knew was that it was close, and it was calling my name, and I was more afraid than I had ever been in my life. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. One moment the cabin was filled with that eerie, wrong howling. The next, silence, pressed in from all sides like a physical weight. I stood in the center of my living room, pistol aimed at nothing, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. For a long moment, nothing happened. The silence stretched on, seconds turning into minutes, my arms beginning to ache from holding the pistol ready. I started to think that maybe it was over, that whatever had been outside had moved on, that I was safe for now. Then something slammed against the cabin wall hard enough to make the whole structure shudder. I spun toward the sound, but before I could react, another impact came from the opposite side, then another from behind. Then above, on the roof, something heavy landing hard enough to shower dust from the ceiling beams. The thing was circling me, hitting the walls one after another in rapid succession, too fast for any single creature to move unless it was faster than anything I could imagine. The impact stopped. I stood in the center of the cabin, surrounded by silence, my breath coming in short gasps, my pistol wavering as I tried to aim at every wall at once. The creature, the thing, was right outside, inches away. I could almost feel it through the wooden walls, that sense of hungry attention, of predatory focus. Then I heard something that I'll never forget as long as I live. A voice, low and rasping, coming from just outside the front door. It didn't speak in words, not exactly, but the sounds it made shaped themselves into something I could almost understand. A mockery of language, a parody of speech, like an animal trying to mimic human communication without any understanding of what the sounds meant. But there was one word I understood perfectly. Marcus. I didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't even think, not really. My mind had gone completely blank, wiped clean by a terror so pure it left no room for anything else. I just stood there, pistol raised, waiting for the door to burst inward and whatever nightmare lay beyond to come flooding through. The voice came again, closer now, almost conversational in its tone. That same awful mimicry, that same stretched and distorted version of my name. And then, incredibly, impossibly, I heard a new sound. Laughter, not human laughter. Nothing close to that. It was a series of short, barking coughs, rhythmic and harsh, like the thing was trying to reproduce a sound it had heard but couldn't quite get right. But the intent was clear. It was laughing at me, enjoying my terror, savoring the moment like a predator playing with its prey. I don't know how long I stood there. Time lost meaning in those terrible minutes, stretching and compressing, until I couldn't tell if seconds had passed or hours. But eventually, gradually, the presence outside began to recede. I felt it pulling back, that awful weight of attention lifting from the cabin like a tide going out. The silence changed quality, becoming empty rather than full, the absence of something rather than its presence. Oh. When I finally found the courage to look through the window, the clearing was empty. The tree line stood silent and still, just as it always had, giving no sign that anything had ever been there. But I knew it was out there, somewhere in the forest, watching and waiting. It had come to my cabin. It had spoken my name. It had shown me, in no uncertain terms, that there was nowhere I could hide that it couldn't find. I was prey now, marked and targeted and singled out. And the hunt was just beginning. I spent the next hour moving through my cabin in a kind of controlled panic, gathering supplies and making preparations that I couldn't have articulated if asked. I wasn't thinking strategically, wasn't forming plans. I was operating on pure instinct, the primitive part of my brain taking over, while the rest of me sat paralyzed with fear. I loaded every weapon I owned, the shotgun, the pistol, the old hunting rifle that had been my father's. I filled my backpack with ammunition, first aid supplies, protein bars, water. I pulled on my heaviest coat, my warmest boots, gloves, and a hat that I shoved into my pockets. I wasn't sure where I was going or what I was planning to do, but every instinct I had was screaming at me to move, to run, to get as far from this place as possible. But I couldn't leave. Not yet. The hunters at Branson camp were still out there. 5 men who had no idea what was stalking these woods, what had been circling their cabin at night, what had just paid me a visit and demonstrated exactly how close it could get without being stopped. If I fled now, if I ran without warning them, their blood would be on my hands. I had to go back to the camp, had to tell them something, convince them to leave, get them on the road to somewhere safe before the sun went down. I was halfway to my truck when I noticed what was lying on the hood. At first I thought it was a bundle of cloth, maybe something that had blown there from the woodpile. But as I got closer, I saw the shape more clearly, saw the familiar outline. The color I recognized. It was my old flannel shirt, the blue and gray one I wore on patrol sometimes, the one with the frayed cuffs and the coffee stain on the breast pocket, the one I hadn't worn in 3 days, the one that should have been hanging on the hook inside my cabin door. It was outside now, spread across my truck like a message, placed there with obvious deliberate care. And when I reached out with trembling fingers to pick it up, I saw what had been done to it. 3 long tears ran down the back of the fabric, parallel lines that matched exactly the gouges I'd seen on the hunting blind's railing. The thing had taken my shirt, had somehow entered my cabin without my knowledge, and taken something that belonged to me, and then it had shredded it with those impossible claws and left it here for me to find. A message, a warning, a demonstration of power. It knows where you live, the gesture said. It can get to you whenever it wants. It can take your things, leave its marks, violate your space in any way it chooses, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. I stood there in my clearing, holding my ruined shirt, and felt something shift inside me. The terror was still there, enormous and overwhelming. But underneath it now was something else. Anger, hot and bitter, rising up from some deep place I hadn't known existed. This thing, this creature, this monster, whatever it was, had been toying with us for days, stalking us, terrorizing us, showing us glimpses of itself, designed to maximize our fear while never giving us a chance to fight back. Well, I was done running, done hiding, done being prey. I stuffed the torn shirt into my truck and climbed behind the wheel, my jaw set in a hard line. I was still afraid. God, I was terrified, But the fear felt different now. Focused. Purposeful. I was going back to Branson camp, and I was going to tell those hunters exactly what was in these woods. And then, together, we were going to figure out what to do about it. Because if this thing wanted a hunt, if it wanted to chase us through the forest and toy with us and call out our names in the dark, then we were damn well going to give it something to remember. The drive to the camp felt shorter this time. My fear transmuted into grim determination. The forest passed by in a blur of dark pines and pale birches. The shadows between the trees no longer threatening but simply obstacles. Things that might hide my enemy but also places where I might hide myself. I was thinking tactically now, analyzing the terrain with a ranger's eye, looking for choke points and defensive positions and lines of sight. The camp clearing came into view through the trees, and immediately I knew something was wrong. The cabin door was hanging open, swinging gently in the breeze. The truck that had been parked beside the building was gone, and standing in the middle of the clearing, their faces pale and their eyes wide, were Mike and two of the other hunters. They were holding rifles, but loosely, their postures those of men who had already been beaten. I stopped my truck and jumped out, my hand going to my pistol. What happened? Where are the others? Mike's face was gray, his lips bloodless. They left, he said, his voice flat and strange. About an hour ago. Frank and Tom packed up and drove out. Said they couldn't stay another night. Said they'd rather lose the trip fees than spend one more minute in these woods. And you stayed? We stayed. Mike's laugh was harsh, humorless. My old man ran this camp for 40 years, never once closed early, never once let fear run him off his own land. Figured I owed him that much at least. Figured we were being paranoid that whatever we'd been hearing was just, hell, I don't know, mass hysteria or something. But then he stopped, his throat working, unable to continue. One of the other hunters, a thin, nervous man named Carl, whose last name I'd never learned, stepped forward. It came while they were loading up, Carl said, his voice shaking. Just walked right out of the trees, bold as anything. Walked on two legs like a man, but it wasn't a man. It was... He broke off, shuddering. It just stood there watching us, watching them pack up and drive away, like it wanted to make sure we saw it, like it wanted us to know we couldn't leave without it letting us. Where is it now? I asked, though I already knew the answer. It was still here. Of course it was still here. It had shown itself deliberately, proven its dominance, and now it was watching us from somewhere in the trees, waiting to see what we would do next. Don't know, Mike said. Vanished back into the forest right after they drove off. But I can feel it, Ranger. Feel it watching us. It's been watching all day, and it's going to keep watching until... He stopped, unable to voice what they were all thinking, until it's ready to do more than watch. I looked at the three men, scared, exhausted, their confidence in the rational world shattered, and I made a decision. Get in my truck, I said. All of you. We're going back to my cabin, and we're going to figure this out together. Carl started to protest, but Mike cut him off with a sharp gesture. He's right. Strength in numbers at least. And the ranger's cabin has to be more defensible than this place. They piled into the truck, cramming themselves into the cab and the bed, their rifles clutched to their chests like talismans. As I climbed behind the wheel, I glanced toward the storage shed where Mike had locked the dogs. Bruiser and Hank, gone, Mike said flatly. Tore through the shed wall sometime in the night. Found blood and fur on the splintered boards this morning. Whether they ran or something got them, he didn't finish. I started the engine, pulling out of the clearing with a spray of gravel, heading back toward my cabin and whatever nightmares the coming darkness would bring. The sun was already beginning to sink toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that might have been beautiful under other circumstances. But all I could see was the darkness gathering between the trees, the shadows lengthening with each passing minute, the night coming closer and closer with promises of terror and death. And somewhere out there, patient and watchful, something that wore a wolf's shape but was not a wolf was preparing for the hunt. We reached my cabin just as the last light bled from the sky, that bruised purple twilight that lingers in November, before the full dark claims everything. The four of us sat in the truck for a long moment after I killed the engine, none of us willing to be the first to step out into the gathering shadows. The cabin looked different to me now, smaller, more fragile, its log walls that had always felt so solid, suddenly seeming thin as paper against whatever was out there in the trees. "Inside," I said finally, my voice rougher than I intended. "Move fast, stay close. Don't look at the tree line." Mike gave me a sharp glance at that last instruction, but he didn't argue. The four of us piled out of the truck and crossed the 30 feet to my front door in a tight cluster, our breath fogging in the cold air, our boots crunching on the frozen ground. I fumbled with my keys. My hands were shaking and I couldn't make them stop. And then we were inside, the door slamming shut behind us, the deadbolt sliding home with a sound that should have been reassuring but wasn't. I lit the kerosene lamps because the generator would take too long to warm up, and the flickering light threw dancing shadows across the walls that made everyone flinch. Carl immediately went to the windows and started pulling the curtains closed, his movements jerky and panicked. Dennis, who had been so defiant earlier, so certain that guns and numbers could protect us, sank into my armchair and put his head in his hands. "Okay," Mike said, setting his rifle against the wall and turning to face me. "What do we do now? What's the plan?" I realized with a cold twist in my gut that they were all looking at me, looking to me for answers, for leadership, for some kind of solution to a problem that had no solution. I was the ranger. I was the one who knew these woods. I was the one. I was supposed to protect people out here. "We wait," I said, because it was the only thing I could think of. "We stay inside, we stay together, and we wait for morning. At first light, we all get in the truck and we drive out of here. We don't stop until we hit Munising." "And tonight?" Carl asked, his voice cracking on the word. "Tonight we take watches, 2-hour shifts, 2 people awake at all times. We keep all the lights on, we keep our weapons ready, and we don't open that door for anything. Not anything." It sounded like a plan. It sounded reasonable, rational, like the kind of thing a trained professional would say in a crisis situation. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew they were meaningless. We weren't dealing with a bear or a mountain lion or any other predator that followed rules that could be predicted and planned for. We were dealing with something that had been toying with us for days, something intelligent and patient and utterly alien to everything I understood about the natural world. Still, having a plan seemed to calm the others. Mike nodded grimly and started checking his rifle. Carl stopped his frantic pacing and began inventorying our supplies. Even Dennis lifted his head from his hands and seemed to pull himself together, the color slowly returning to his face. We ate cold food from cans. None of us wanted to risk the noise and light of the propane stove, and we talked in low voices about meaningless things. Sports scores, weather forecasts, anything to fill the silence, anything to keep our minds from dwelling on what was outside. I learned that Carl was a high school teacher from Grand Rapids, that Mike had 3 grandchildren and was supposed to be at his youngest daughter's Thanksgiving dinner in 4 days. Dennis stayed quiet, staring at the wall. Normal lives, normal people, all of us stuck in this cabin waiting for something impossible to come knocking at the door. The first 2 hours passed without incident. I took the first watch with Mike, the 2 of us sitting at opposite ends of the cabin with our weapons across our laps, listening to the wind moan through the pines and the fire crackle in the wood stove. The sounds were ordinary, familiar, the same sounds I'd heard 1,000 nights in this cabin. But they felt wrong now, hollow, like a recording playing on a loop, while something else lurked just beneath the surface. At 10 o'clock, we woke Carl and Dennis to take the second shift. I lay down on my bed but couldn't sleep, just stared at the ceiling and listened to the low murmur of the 2 men talking and the steady tick of my wind-up clock on the mantel. The night pressed against the windows like a living thing, thick and black and hungry. I must have dozed at some point, because the next thing I knew, I was jerking awake to the sound of Dennis's voice, high and strange and trembling. Ranger, you need to see this." I was on my feet before I was fully conscious, my hand already closing around the grip of my revolver. The cabin was dark except for the glow of the kerosene lamps, their light casting long shadows that seemed to writhe and shift with every flicker of the flames. Mike was awake too, sitting bolt upright on the floor where he'd been sleeping, his rifle already in his hands. Dennis was standing at the window, the curtain pulled back just enough for him to peer out into the darkness. His face was the color of old snow, his eyes wide and fixed on something outside. "What is it?" I asked, though I already knew. Some part of me had known since the moment I'd opened my eyes. "It's here," Dennis whispered. "God help us, it's right here." I crossed to the window and looked out into the night, and what I saw in that moment will stay with me until the day I die. The full moon had risen while I slept, painting the clearing in front of my cabin in shades of silver and shadow. And standing in the middle of that clearing, perfectly still, perfectly patient, was the thing that had been hunting us. I had seen pieces of it before, glimpses, fragments that my mind had tried desperately to explain away or forget. But now I saw all of it, every impossible detail rendered crystal clear in the cold moonlight. And there was no more room for denial. It stood on 2 legs like a man. But no man had ever possessed proportions like these. 8 feet tall, at least, maybe more. With shoulders so broad, they seemed to block out the forest behind it. Its body was covered in coarse gray-brown fur that gleamed dully in the moonlight, matted in places with something dark and wet that I refused to think about too closely. Its arms hung past its knees, corded with muscle, ending in hands that were simultaneously human and lupine. 5 fingers, but too long, too thin, tipped with claws that looked like curved black knives. But it was the head that haunted me, that will always haunt me. A wolf's head, but wrong. The snout was too long, the skull too large, the brow ridge protruding in a way that suggested terrible intelligence lurking behind those eyes. And the eyes, God, the eyes. They caught the moonlight and threw it back in an amber glow that pulsed with hunger and awareness and something that might have been amusement. It had the mouth of a predator. Black lips pulled back to reveal teeth that were too large, too numerous, yellowed with age, and stained with old blood. As I watched, frozen in horror, it opened that mouth and its tongue lolled out, long and red and glistening. The gesture was almost canine, almost playful, like a dog happy to see its master. But there was nothing playful in those eyes, nothing at all. "Marcus," it said. The voice was wrong. Everything about the voice was wrong. It was deep and rumbling, more felt than heard, like thunder rolling up from the earth itself. But buried within that sound, twisted and distorted but still somehow recognizable, was a human voice. Multiple human voices, layered on top of each other, speaking my name in a horrible chorus. I stumbled backward from the window, my revolver coming up without conscious thought. Behind me I heard Carl let out a sob that sounded like it was torn from the depths of his soul. "Don't let it in," Mike was saying over and over, a mantra against the impossible. "Don't let it in, don't let it in, don't." The creature moved. One moment it was standing in the clearing, motionless as a statue. The next it was at my front door, crossing the distance between us in a blur of gray fur and gleaming teeth. The impact of its body against the door shook the entire cabin, sent dust raining from the rafters, knocked 2 of my kerosene lamps off their hooks to shatter on the floor. The door held. Thank God the door held. But even as I watched, I could see the wood beginning to splinter around the hinges, could see the deadbolt straining against a force no lock was ever designed to resist. "The back window!" I shouted, pointing toward the small window in my bedroom that overlooked the forest behind the cabin. "Go, now!" Carl and Dennis moved, scrambling toward the bedroom like men possessed. Mike hesitated, his rifle still pointed at the door, his face twisted with an expression I recognized. He wanted to fight, wanted to stand his ground, wanted to prove that he wasn't just prey to be run down and devoured. "Mike, we can't fight it. Not here. We need to move." Another impact. The door buckled inward, a crack appearing down its center. Through the gap, I could see gray fur, could smell copper and rot and musk, could hear that terrible voice speaking words I couldn't quite understand. Mike finally broke. We both ran for the bedroom, nearly tripping over each other in our haste. Carl already had the window open, was helping Dennis squeeze his bulk through the narrow opening. The cold night air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of pine and snow and something else, something primal and terrifying. Dennis dropped to the ground outside. Carl followed. Mike went next, grunting as his shoulders scraped against the window frame. I was last, hauling myself up onto the sill just as I heard my front door explode inward behind me. I didn't look back. I couldn't look back. I threw myself through the window and hit the frozen ground hard, the impact driving the air from my lungs and sending spikes of pain through my shoulder. But I was up immediately, running, following the others into the dark forest as the sounds of destruction erupted behind us. We ran. I don't know how long we ran or how far. Time lost meaning in that nightmare flight through the frozen woods. Branches whipped at our faces, roots grabbed at our feet. The forest that I had loved for 8 years transformed into an obstacle course designed to slow us down, to let the thing behind us catch up. I could hear it crashing through the underbrush somewhere behind us, could hear those horrible vocalizations that sounded almost, but not quite, like words. Dennis fell first. He went down hard, his foot catching on something in the dark, his body hitting the ground with a heavy thud. I stopped, turned back, grabbed his arm, and tried to haul him to his feet. "My ankle," he gasped. "I think it's broken. God, Marcus, I can't." "Leave him," Carl screamed from somewhere ahead of us. "It's coming. It's right behind us." I looked up and saw it. A shape moving through the trees, impossibly fast, impossibly silent now that it had given up stealth for speed. Moonlight glinted off teeth and claws and those terrible amber eyes. "Go," Dennis said. His voice was calm, resigned, the voice of a man who had already made peace with what was about to happen. "Someone has to make it out. Someone has to tell people." I wanted to argue, wanted to drag him with me, carry him if I had to. But I could see the creature coming closer, could see the way it was moving. Not running at us directly, but angling to cut us off, to drive us where it wanted us to go. It was still hunting, still playing with us. I ran. The screaming started seconds later. Dennis is screaming. I'll hear that sound for the rest of my life. The sound of a man being torn apart in the dark by something that shouldn't exist. It went on for a long time, too long. And then it stopped with an abrupt finality that was somehow worse than the screaming had been. I found Mike and Carl huddled behind a massive fallen oak, their faces ghost pale in the darkness, their breathing ragged and desperate. We crouched there together, listening to the sounds of the forest, waiting for the creature to find us. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I lost all sense of time, and then I heard him. "Mike, Carl, Marcus," our names, called out in that horrible layered voice, called from somewhere close, so close, hidden in the darkness between the trees. "I see you." Carl broke. He stood up and ran, ignoring Mike's shouted warning, ignoring my grab for his jacket. He made it maybe 50 feet before the creature took him. One moment he was running, his arms pumping, his feet pounding against the frozen ground. The next moment something gray and massive erupted from the shadows to his left. And Carl was gone, snatched out of the air like a rabbit taken by an owl. This time there was no screaming, just a wet crunching sound that seemed to go on forever. Mike and I looked at each other. In that moment, in that glance, we communicated everything that needed to be said. We were going to die. We both knew it. But maybe, just maybe, we could go down fighting. "The ranger station," I whispered. "Half-mile east, there's a propane tank. If we can get there." Mike nodded grimly. "Lead the way." We moved through the forest like ghosts, using every trick I'd learned in 8 years as a ranger. We stayed low, stayed quiet, used the wind to cover our sounds, and the shadows to hide our movement. The creature was out there. We could feel it watching, but it seemed to have pulled back, giving us room, letting us run, toying with us again, always toying with us. The ranger station materialized out of the darkness like a dream, its familiar shape impossibly welcome in that nightmare landscape. I had the key in my hand before we reached the door, and then we were inside, the lock clicking behind us. The walls of the small building suddenly the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. "The propane tank," I said, moving toward the storage room in the back. "Help me move it." We wrestled the heavy tank into the main room, positioning it near the building's single window. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely work the valve. But finally I got it open, could hear the hiss of gas escaping into the small space. "When it comes through that door," I said, pulling out my lighter, "we run for the window." I light the gas, we jump, and we pray to God the explosion slows it down enough for us to reach the road. Mike's laugh was raw, broken. That's the plan? That's the best you've got? That's all I've got. The creature hit the door like a freight train. Wood exploded inward, and for one frozen moment I saw it clearly, all of it, framed in the shattered doorway like some vision from a medieval nightmare. 8 feet of muscle and fur and rage, its eyes blazing amber in the darkness, its mouth open wide to reveal rows of teeth that gleamed wetly in the moonlight, streaming through the broken door. "Go!" I screamed. Mike threw himself toward the window. I touched my lighter to the gas streaming from the propane tank, and then everything was fire and thunder and pain. The explosion picked me up and threw me like a rag doll. I felt something crack in my shoulder, felt fire lick across my arms, felt the world spin crazily around me as I flew through the air. I hit something hard. The ground, a tree I never knew. And then I was rolling, tumbling, coming to rest face down in a drift of dead leaves. I could hear screaming, high, piercing, almost human. The creature, somewhere behind me, somewhere in the flames that were now consuming the ranger station and spreading to the trees around it. The sound was terrible, agonized, enraged, betrayed. I forced myself to my feet. My left arm hung useless at my side. My right arm was blistered and raw from fingertips to elbow, and every breath felt like swallowing broken glass. But I was alive. I was alive, and I had to move. Mike was lying 10 feet away, stunned but conscious, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. I grabbed him with my good hand and hauled him upright, and together we stumbled toward the road, toward my truck, toward anything that wasn't this forest of terror and death. Behind us, the screaming stopped. But I could hear something else now. Crashing, breaking, the sound of something large moving through the burning woods. It was coming after us. Even now, even after the fire, it was still coming. We reached my truck. The keys were still in my pocket, somehow, miraculously. I got the engine started on the second try, threw it into gear, and floored the accelerator. Gravel sprayed behind us as we rocketed down the forest road, the flames of the burning ranger station casting orange light across the trees. In the rear-view mirror, just before we rounded the first curve, I saw it standing at the edge of the road, burned, wounded, but still standing, still watching. Those amber eyes caught the firelight and glowed like twin coals in the darkness, and then the curve swept it from view, and we were gone. I drove 40 miles without stopping, without slowing, without speaking a single word. Mike sat beside me in stunned silence, his hand pressed to the wound on his head, his eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance that only he could see. The forest flew past us in a blur of shadows and moonlight, and I didn't let myself breathe until the trees gave way to open fields and the lights of Munising appeared on the horizon. The emergency room staff didn't ask too many questions at first. They saw our injuries, my dislocated shoulder, my burns, Mike's head wound, and they went to work, professional and efficient, patching us up with the practiced ease of people who dealt with hunting accidents and logging injuries every day. But eventually the questions came. What happened? What attacked us? Where are the others? I told them a story, not the truth. I couldn't tell them the truth, could already see the way the ER doctor's eyes narrowed when I started talking about the creature. But a version of it, a large predator, a bear maybe, or something else, something I couldn't identify in the dark, an explosion when we tried to scare it off with the propane tank. My friend's lost in the woods, probably dead. They called the sheriff. A deputy came, took my statement, wrote it all down in his little notebook, with an expression that shifted slowly from concern to skepticism to something that looked uncomfortably like the expression you'd give a man having a breakdown. "You're saying a bear attacked your cabin and chased you through the woods?" he asked, his pen hovering over the page. "I'm saying something did. And this something killed 2 people. Yes." The deputy looked at me for a long moment. Then he closed his notebook and stood up. "We'll send a team out at first light," he said. "You should get some rest, Mr. Windrider. You've been through a lot." They found the bodies 3 days later. What was left of them? The official report listed the cause of death as large predator attack, species undetermined. There was talk of bringing in wildlife experts, of organizing a hunt for whatever had killed 2 men in the Hiawatha National Forest. Nothing came of it. The investigation quietly closed after 2 weeks. Bear attack, the final report concluded. Unusual behavior, possibly due to disease or injury. No further action required. I didn't argue. I had seen the way people looked at me when I tried to describe what had really happened. Had seen the glances exchanged between the doctors and nurses at the hospital, the way the sheriff's deputy kept looking toward the psychiatric ward down the hall. I was the ranger who'd cracked under pressure, the survivor whose mind had invented monsters to explain a tragedy he couldn't process. Better to be thought crazy than to keep pushing a truth no one would ever believe. I resigned from the Park Service 3 weeks after the attack. My supervisor tried to talk me out of it, offered counseling, suggested a leave of absence instead of a permanent departure. But I couldn't go back. Couldn't set foot in those woods again, couldn't even think about them, without feeling that primal terror rising up from somewhere deep in my gut. I sold my cabin to a young couple from Detroit who wanted a rustic getaway. Didn't tell them what had happened there. Couldn't. They were so excited, so eager, and I couldn't find the words to explain that they were buying a place touched by something that should not exist. I hope they're okay. I try not to think about it. I moved to Saginaw, found a job as a security guard at a community college, walking the halls at night, checking doors and windows, pretending that my hypervigilance was just professional dedication rather than the barely controlled paranoia it actually was. It's a good job for someone like me. Lots of light, lots of people, lots of walls between me and the wild places where things like that creature might still be hunting. Mike emails me sometimes. We don't talk about what happened, not directly, but there's an understanding between us, a shared knowledge that binds us together in ways that are hard to explain. He moved to Arizona after the attack, says he can't stand the cold anymore, can't stand the sight of trees. I understand. I understand completely. Sarah called me once about 2 months after I moved to Saginaw. She'd seen something on the news about the attack, some local interest story about the mysterious predator deaths in the Upper Peninsula. She wanted to know if I was okay, wanted to know if I needed anything. We talked for an hour, circling around the truth, without ever quite touching it. She could tell something was wrong. Sarah always could read me better than anyone. But I couldn't bring myself to tell her what had really happened. Couldn't stand to see that look in her eyes, the one I'd seen in everyone else's eyes when I tried to explain about the creature. The look that said I'd finally lost my mind. My brother David thinks I had a breakdown, says I need to see someone, a professional, someone who can help me process the trauma of losing 2 men in a bear attack. He doesn't understand why I won't talk about it, why I change the subject whenever he brings up the forest, why I refuse his invitations to come up north for the holidays. I'm not having a breakdown. I'm not suffering from PTSD or survivor's guilt or any of the other clinical terms that might explain my behavior. I'm afraid. I'm afraid because I saw something impossible, something that shouldn't exist, and I know with absolute certainty that it's still out there. It's been 3 years now. 3 years since that night in the burning ranger station, since I saw those amber eyes watching me from the edge of the firelit road. 3 years of living in a third-floor apartment with no trees visible from any window, of sleeping with the lights on and a loaded shotgun within arm's reach, of waking up at every strange sound with my heart pounding and my hand reaching for a weapon. I've tried to move on, tried to convince myself that it was just one creature, one isolated horror, confined to that particular stretch of forest and unable to follow me into my new life. During the day, when the sun is shining and people are going about their normal business all around me, I can almost believe it. But at night, the truth settles back over me like a shroud. Every November, when hunting season opens up north, I take vacation days. I stay inside with the curtains drawn, the television on for noise, anything to distract myself from thinking about the woods and the men who go into them without knowing what might be waiting. I read the news obsessively during those weeks, scanning for stories about missing hunters, unusual animal attacks, bodies found torn apart by unknown predators. There are more of those stories than you'd think. A lot more. I don't know what the creature was, don't know where it came from or why it chose those particular woods or whether it was the only one of its kind or just one of many. I've spent countless hours researching, digging through old newspapers and folklore collections and websites run by people who claim to have seen things like what I saw. Dogmen, they call them. Werewolves, skinwalkers, beast of Bray Road. None of the names feel quite right. None of the descriptions capture the terrible intelligence in those amber eyes, the calculated cruelty of a creature that had hunted us, not out of hunger, but out of something darker, something that might almost be called pleasure. Some nights, when the wind is right and the hour is late, I swear I can hear howling. Faint, distant, probably just my imagination or a stray dog somewhere in the city. But it sounds like the howling I heard in those woods. That terrible rising cry that was almost, but not quite a word. I tell myself it's nothing. I tell myself I'm safe here, surrounded by concrete and glass and artificial light. I tell myself that even if the creature is still out there, still hunting, it would never leave its forest home to follow one man to a city 200 miles away. I tell myself a lot of things, but I keep the shotgun loaded. I keep the lights on, and every night, before I can finally sleep, I check every lock on every door and window, and I stand for a long moment staring out at the city lights that have replaced the stars I used to love. And I remind myself that I survived. I survived. It doesn't feel like victory. It feels like borrowed time, like the creature simply decided to let me go that night, chose to end the hunt for reasons I'll never understand. Maybe it got what it wanted from Dennis and Carl. Maybe my escape was part of some larger game, a way to spread fear beyond those particular woods. Maybe. And this is the thought that keeps me awake more than any other. It's waiting. Waiting for me to lower my guard. Waiting for me to forget. waiting for the day when I finally convince myself that it was all just a nightmare, that the rational explanations must be true, that I can go back to the forest without fear. I won't. Not ever. Whatever that thing was, whatever impossible truth it represents about the world we think we know, I understand now that there are places humans don't belong, edges of the map where the old rules still apply, where something ancient and hungry is still waiting for foolish men who venture too far from the light. I think about Mike sometimes, baking in the Arizona sun, probably as haunted as I am, but coping in his own way. I think about Dennis and Carl, their names already fading from public memory, just more statistics in the long tally of men who went into the woods and never came out. I think about the creature, out there somewhere in the frozen forests of the Upper Peninsula, still hunting, still calling out names in the darkness. And I think about the truth that no one will ever believe, the truth that I'll carry to my grave. There are monsters in this world, real monsters. Not metaphors, not symbols, not psychological projections. Things with teeth and claws and amber eyes that glow in the dark. They're watching. They're waiting. And when you finally see one, really see it the way I saw it that night in the moonlit clearing, you'll never feel safe again, not ever. This is my testimony. This is my confession. This is the story I've never told anyone, the truth that festers inside me like an infected wound. I don't expect you to believe it. I don't even want you to believe it. Because believing means understanding, and understanding means knowing that the darkness is not empty. It's so much worse than empty. My name is Marcus Windrider. I was a park ranger in the Hiawatha National Forest, and for 6 nights in November, something that wore a wolf's shape, but was not a wolf hunted our hunting camp. It's still out there. It remembers my name. And some nights, when the wind is just right, I could swear I hear it howling for me, calling me back to the dark place where our hunt first began, calling me home. I won't go. I'll never go. But sometimes, in my weakest moments, I wonder if I'll ever have a choice.